All right.
It's recording.
Ready? Okay, I'm going to get started. Good evening. I am Richard Brady. I'm the president of Matrix Consulting Group and a project manager who's been working with Austining on this Police Reform and Reinvention Collaborative. This is a meeting of the Working Committee on January 13th, 2021. And the purpose of this meeting is to go over the work of the subcommittees that were created last month to help the Working Committee focus on some areas of potential change within the police department and in policing in Austining. And so it's all coming together at this meeting. The 4 subcommittees that we created took groupings of potential improvement opportunities in the Executive Order 203 from the state of New York and grouped them into some areas that made sense. One was a group of topics around internal operations. The second one was on hiring and training. The third one was on policies and procedures. And the last one was on governance and oversight. So we have met, each one of the subcommittees have met 2 or 3 times, depending on the subcommittee. The most recent one was late last night, I understand. So I thought what would make sense in this situation is for me to share my screen and to go through the summary document that we created that that summarizes the work, the suggested recommendations that have come out of each one of the subcommittees. And I thought myself or Ian could give a quick summary of what we came up with in each committee, but then open it for discussion. I think probably first from the members who were in each one of the subcommittees to elaborate any one of the areas that make sense, but then open it up. So I think the ultimate objective is to see which areas, which of these suggested recommendations could be supported by the Working Committee for inclusion in the report that's going to come out of this Working Committee in the next week or so. We probably need to decide on a process for doing that. Is this going to be a vote? Is this going to be affirmation? Is this going to be things that we can make a decision about later once we have the full report? Either of those are viable options, either making a decision now for inclusion in the report or once it's in the draft report, coming to some decision about whether it's got the approval of all the Working Committee members or a majority of them. So does that make sense for a process? So I also want to be a little mindful of the time. I know it's early evening for most of you, and so I don't want to stifle discussion either, but we've got 4 topics, an hour and a half. It could go longer than that, but I think at maybe 25 or 30 minutes of discussion, we should probably move on to the next topic area. So I'll be mindful of that. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. And most of you should have seen that. I noticed overnight that once I had indicated that this summary was up there, many people had gone on and downloaded it or at least looked at it. Some people actually requested some edits to the text as well, which we did. So the first one we're going to summarize is the work that came out of the Internal Operations Committee. So there were 5 groups of suggested recommendations that came out of this subcommittee. A couple relating to emergency response, several recommendations about enhancing community policing approaches, one specifically about public awareness relating to the police department's relationship with ICE when they're in the community. And we took on the area of police officer mental health and had some recommendations on that one as well. So in the mental health crisis unit is the first area that we looked at. And the idea here is that the police department, even with additional training, which we will look at in another subcommittee's results, may not always be the best responder to mental health crises situations. In an emerging area in many police departments in New York and around the country are to have some other mental health crisis intervention or response unit available to co-respond with the police department that would not only provide a more appropriate response to the situation and the needs of the situation, but follow-up case management as well, so that people who had the response could be directed to county, private, not-for-profit kinds of mental health resources as well. Recognizing that this is a long-term improvement opportunity because it would take additional resources to implement this. There are a variety of options here. It's probably unrealistic given the size of Ossining to have this, the village on its own create a unit like this, but either in collaboration with the county or with neighboring communities implement something that is beyond what you're able to do right now. Related to that, the second recommendation is something I believe Yonkers is doing, where they've created a volunteer emergency responder registry to assist police and fire responders to make a more appropriate response. The idea here is to develop information about households where there were special needs, so that there would be pre-arrival information to emergency responders, police, fire, EMS, so that they could be aware of what could be a potentially volatile situation without that knowledge. This is, as recommendations go, a fairly short-term improvement opportunity. It does take some resources to implement a registry. Again, it is voluntary, but it can help in response. We had a number of ideas to improve community policing in the community. One was to create liaisons between police officers and specific community groups, which would be a collateral duty for police officers, whether they were reaching out to the Hispanic community, the African American community, LGBTQ community, others as well, have responsibility to have outreach for problem solving, communication, et cetera. Greater presence at community special events. We realize that this is something that the police department, especially the police chief, does quite a bit of, but the idea was to have a presence at all community events as much as necessary, especially once things are opening up again after COVID, and to have them more visible and approachable by the community. Create education and mentoring in the schools directed toward violence reduction. There are a lot of programs out there, some sponsored by academic institutions, like John Jay has a program for violence reduction, but others as well. This would take additional resources because it takes some training and specialization and time for police officers to be involved in the schools in that way. Coordinate education and not really mentoring services, but education efforts with other village services, thinking specifically about parks and recreation and potentially other services as well. Post-COVID, getting back more to the personal interaction that's possible with footbeats. Most of these are short-term improvement opportunities that don't require significant additional resources, except possibly the more heavily programmatic area of being in the schools more. So,
hey, Richard, can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
This is Jennifer.
Yeah.
On the coordinating education efforts with other village services, can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, it's really an information sharing thing where, for example, if you've got information about something like violence reduction or community meetings on substance abuse or things directed to youth, that don't just rely on the police department to be the funnel for this kind of information, but recreational services, schools certainly, and other village services, village and regional services to be leveraged to help get the word out.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So ICE comes up in a policy suggested recommendation later, but this one is really just dealing with the public awareness that is needed associated with what the police department's role is with respect to ICE when they are in the community. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about what their roles are, and or ununderstanding. And so there needs to be some sort of public awareness campaign in both English and Spanish to talk about what the police department's role is. So there's a recommendation later about what that role should be. So don't want to step on Ian's toes here. Or actually, this was mine, it's under policies. A number of suggested recommendations on police officer mental health, a very important topic today, given everything that's happened, that they need support as well. A number of ideas relating to counseling, but surrounding a decision about whether they should be voluntary or on request of the officer, or mandatory at specific frequencies, or after an on-duty crisis response. A really good idea, I thought, of expanding or making available the use of teletherapy sessions to, especially if counseling is mandated, to help keep the confidentiality of the person, the police officer who's seeking the assistance, more anonymous. In support of police officer assistance, a more robust employee assistance program to help funnel resources relating to mental health, other kinds of counseling and support that police officers need in the highly stressful job that they're in. Developing an early intervention program. This can be as complicated as you want it to be. There are systems out there, computer systems that tie into human resource management systems and other things to identify where there are issues which lead to the conclusion that there may be an issue of stress in a police officer, looking at absences, looking at complaints made against an officer, things like that, and using that as a way to having an early intervention of the employee. And these are getting far more common around the United States. These are mostly longer term opportunities, mostly because they require additional resources, but also to the extent that you make anything mandatory, there's collective bargaining side of it as well. So that is the summary. Any discussion from our subcommittee first?
This is Jackie. I just wanted to point out that the mental health crisis team we're talking about, one of the things we discussed is setting it up on a model that kind of mimics what OVAC does, where they're serving several municipalities, but it's one team. So that's kind of the model we were thinking about, some kind of coordination like that. And also the mental health team would also respond to things like substance abuse and homelessness.
Absolutely.
I wanted to.
I will update these notes, but I'm just writing them out right now. Okay.
I wanted to comment on a couple of the things that you had in community police.
That sounds great.
All right, Richard, are you there? I mean, can I go ahead with that?
Yes, please.
All right. A couple of the things that you mentioned in there, they were pretty summarized, and I just wanted to be a little more specific in some of the presentation that I gave regarding that. Like, for example, the police interaction with community organizations, and I believe you had a greater presence, which is definitely a factor in what I was conveying. But basically, I was trying to say that we should also try to find more creative ways of engagement, not only in the not only in social events, but in social service related events. So that would be more of a a generality to the summary that you had in that area.
Okay. I will add that.
Also in the school area that you mentioned, you mentioned students
Mhm.
and engagement with the students. And one of the things that I had in there that was a more specific point was to explore efforts to improve the profile of police officers as perceived by youth, and in order to promote career possibilities. You know, I think that added in there, we need to start to kind of grow our crops in terms of some of the youth that would like to perhaps, you know, one day pursue a career in law enforcement. So that was a part of my thinking in that area as well.
That's a good one, and that ties into a suggested recommendation that came out of the hiring subcommittee. Anything else from anybody inside or outside the subcommittee?
Yeah, I have a question. I know we had, when we were having discussions about this, we talked a lot of how active and presence Chief Sylvester had, and you know, making a lot of room for that for the rest of the force to also be very active. So I do think that in some, like, have a greater presence and more community special events, that, you know, larger police force specificity could help.
Okay. Yep, that's right.
And if I might say, it could be as easy as just to change the place where some of these events take place. Because, for instance, when we have our Spanish community meeting, they love the idea of coffee with a cup, but they said that it could be adapted to some of the cultural places where the Spanish people hang out. So there was mention potentially to having one of these events at one of the Hispanic restaurants in town. So just to change the setting of where these events can happen, so it the Hispanic community can relate more to that.
Yeah. Okay, good. What's a restaurant, by the way?
Probably it's in my notes. I will have to check, but it seems to be a very good one in town.
I can't remember what one is.
Richard?
Yes.
Yeah, I also wanted to add in that community policing piece, the one of the things that I conveyed was to have an ongoing coalition between the community, certain community members and police, you know, as an ongoing coalition, if you will, to further adhere to some of the recommendations that I had given.
That's different than liaison? I'm not understanding.
I think slightly, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
With
Because,
folks
you know, I mean, it would, although from what I gathered from Webster, coalition, it refers to more of a temporary situation. I'm just using that word in a more permanent situation, that we should, you know, have factions of the community, you know, combined with police on an ongoing meeting level.
Okay. Got it.
Rich, you might want to use the word community stakeholders. I know that Austin oftentimes uses that phrasing for groups or organizations or community groups. I think, Kendall, that might work what you're saying, that if the PD had a ongoing conversation with multiple groups, it would be helpful for their efforts for community policing as well as ours to be engaged and to share back and forth.
Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. Okay.
I I'm wondering about the mandatory counseling
Mm.
for police officer mental health, and how that would be determined, who would determine that, right? That if someone, is that like something that comes from CPCRB? Is that something that comes from the chief? Is that something that comes from the, the mental health crisis unit? How is that determined?
Well, if the mandatory route was the approach selected, it wouldn't be an approach where a determination is made necessarily. It's doing it at specific frequencies for everybody.
Got it. Okay.
And then it would be after the certain kinds of crises responses, like a death or an officer involved shooting, those types of situations.
Got
So I
it.
think it's a little different with the early intervention program, and that's why that takes a lot more work and a lot more work working with the collective bargaining group, because in that one you are selecting indicators that indicate that there may be some underlying cause, and that's a trigger, as it were, for some kind of intervention, usually counseling.
So can I just add into that piece, because I did want to touch a little bit on it before we move on, because I know Kendall and myself and Jackie were speaking, as well as Officer Irvin, with Richard, we're talking about creating this mental health program, and the importance that we saw in the officers having a counseling sessions that were mandatory. It says here, example, annually. We were talking about different types of frequencies. My vision, and anyone who wants to step in, is in order to decrease the stigma on mental health, providing more frequency and mandatory counseling for officers will decrease the stigma. So if we're able to provide officers with monthly, and then maybe hopefully graduating up to bi-weekly or weekly mandatory counseling sessions, the stigma on seeking help in terms of mental health will reduce. It will also help our officers take some mental stress off, especially with the political climate right now. I feel like it's very necessary to make sure that our officers have someone to speak to. And so that would be the goal, to make sure that we have mental health counseling provided for all of our officers. I know that Officer Irvin said that there are programs when, an officer is in a crisis situation, have it be, in their own personal life or on the job, they do have services through Westchester County. However, my fear is that waiting until a big crisis happens might be a little bit too late, and might not be enough. So that was our suggestion, that we start, providing mandatory counseling. And that's why we put the option of a teletherapy. If some officers are more comfortable with doing it, from their cars, from their homes. I know Officer Irvin said that he would prefer to see someone face to face if he wants to talk about his problems, and that should also be offered, as well as having maybe more postings in terms of the locker room or even in the police department for numbers, listings, providers of who they can call when they need or feel like they need mental health counseling.
Hey, Richard, maybe you could just talk for a minute, because it's a great idea, but can you maybe help fill the group in on some of the legal hurdles they're going to have to get over in order to mandate mental health treatment for people that are voluntary?
Well, it's a combination of legal, but it's also in a collective bargaining environment of requiring people to do something that can be viewed as an invasion of privacy or some issue such as that. So it's usually a negotiated item to develop something like an early intervention program.
But just to be clear, when we're talking about weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly mental health appointments mandated by a municipality, that, unless it's consented to, is not legal to implement on somebody. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, I was going to suggest not that frequency, that level of frequency, just because scheduling this alone with the amount of officers that the PD has might not even just be feasible. But if it was maybe twice a year,
Well, set aside the hundreds of thousands of dollars it would cost to go weekly for an entire department in overtime. Even one appointment to mandate somebody to mental health treatment without cause is not legal.
No, I get what you're saying about, yeah, and that would be, have to go through the PBA. I think we understand that.
I have a quick comment related or associated with this topic. I know a lot of municipalities, I'm not sure if Ossining currently is doing that, the police department, but chaplaincy service is more friendly and amenable. And a lot of communities do this, where you have chaplains that actually work on an ongoing basis and constantly with the police department that provides that kind of counseling service. For instance, when I did my chaplaincy, I had to do a bachelor's program in psychology, in psychology of counseling. And so while I do pastoral counseling, there's a mixture there of psychological counseling, but it happens in a friendly way, in a friendly, non-threatening environment where no one is mandated and no one has to have a quote unquote an issue or diagnosed with anything to speak to a chaplain. And most communities that I know of, I lived in New Jersey for many years, that's how it's done, where chaplains are really assigned to the police department, and it's done on an ongoing, non-threatening basis.
I agree. I know that, Chief, when we talked about it, when I first moved here, we talked about it. And I know that even White Plains has several of all different faiths. So it's not just Christian, but you have rabbis, you have Catholics. So that however people worship or don't worship, they feel comfortable talking to someone that would, keep their secrets. But
yeah, we've done quite a bit in creating voluntary programs for people in order to make resources available to them. If we're going to make recommendations and publish a document, I think that there's an obligation for everybody making these recommendations to know that if you're making a recommendation for something that cannot legally be accomplished unless there's consent, you got to be realistic about what's going to come from it. And mandating people to mental health it's not something that we as a municipality can do.
Right.
But the chaplaincy, I think, is the easier option of saying it's not mandatory, but if there's a faith leader around that says, hey, I'll do some rides with you all, I'll be available, go on site when situations take place. The officer gets to know those persons, in and off, off the job. It's not mandatory, but they still have somebody they can go to, aside from the mental health aspect.
Well, how would you recommend doing it though? I'm sorry. How would you recommend doing it though, Chief? Something like what they're talking about.
So what we have right now is we have an officer who had gone through and interviewed about a dozen different mental health providers, narrowed down a list of people that are within our insurance, which is a real challenge these days to find somebody that accepts your insurance, and they change so frequently. So we have an officer that keeps in touch with all of those mental health providers on a regular basis, interviewed them to decide if there were people that officer felt would be a good match for people among our staff. Went and checked locations to see if they were in places that she felt that coworkers would be apt to be willing to visit, because there is such a stigma around mental health. And particularly when people find out that a police officer seeks any sort of help, there's oftentimes a very quick follow-up to remove firearms, and oftentimes that challenges employment. So we've published that list on a number of occasions. In terms of chaplains, we haven't implemented those. There have been challenges to that in the past that aren't appropriate to go into right now. But in terms of how would I go about mandating mental health,
making it, expanding it to a little bit more of what they're trying to do within the, the requirements of the collective bargaining and all that kind of stuff.
I can't speak to collective bargaining, but as the commanding officer of the police department, what would I do to cause people to go into mental health? I wouldn't as an employer. I encourage people all the time.
Accessibility, maybe not mandating, but
right. So in terms of accessibility, we published already lists of people they can go to, confirm that it's within their insurance network, interviewed by their coworkers to be vetted to say that it's somebody that another police officer, their peer at their rank, felt was appropriate for them. And that's where we leave it at that point. Anytime we have a critical incident, we debrief afterwards and talk to our officers about those resources that are available. We have officers that have sought mental health that speak to their coworkers about what that experience is like. This conversation that I'm having isn't at all about making resources available. I just think that it has to be really clearly stated that when we get into the word mandatory and you deal with medical or mental health, it is absolutely off the table. You can say that you can present something that may be on consent to the department. Perhaps the PBA wants to consider that in terms of their within the context of collective bargaining.
Right.
But when you talk about mandatory mental health, and we're sitting here talking about why cops shouldn't go on mental health calls, the irony is sort of striking to me here that while we try to take cops out of the realm of forcing people to go to mental health, we're sitting here talking about forcing cops to go.
Right. Well, this was a choice that came out of the subcommittee. I mean, it can be one or the other. It would definitely be a very uphill struggle with little likelihood of success to mandate it, but we could strike that and focus on making sure that appropriate counseling opportunities were available, either through the psychological community, medical community, or faith-based organizations. These are your suggested recommendations.
Okay, a question for the chief. Currently, if there's an officer that you've identified that genuinely has a problem based on an incident or incidences, do you recommend or mandate that officer to receive counseling?
Yes, we can. There's what's called the fitness for duty evaluation, and we've used those before for an officer where we're concerned about behavior or something they've said or whatever, and that is a compelled investigation. Ordinarily, if you have that level of concern for somebody, you're normally taking weapons and modifying them and things like that so that they're not out in public. But there's a lot of space between nothing's wrong and fitness for duty evaluations. Fitness for duty is an investigation to see if you're fit to do the job. Everywhere in between there are an awful lot of conversations we have with people about, hey, here's some resources that are available to you. Here's what it's like. Here's when I'm going to find out, and here's when I'm not. And I'll tell you that I don't think cops are dissimilar from most other people in society. The biggest hurdle to mental health is, even for people with the best of insurance, finding a provider that accepts your insurance and stays with it. That is the biggest hurdle, because I've had people that have a provider and dealing with the public who doesn't have access to these things. So I think that in terms of offering something to police officers that really moves the ball forward in terms of ensuring that they've got appropriate opportunities for stress relief, and these are really a lot of self-help type things, directing themselves, is making as many resources available as possible. Should we have people come in and talk to we used to have briefings where we come in at the beginning of the shift and the whole shift would sit there. And would it be helpful to have people come in and present on what that's like, professionals? Absolutely. Little hard to do now, maybe Zoom meetings, perhaps. But I think that some familiarization with the process would really go a long way. But I think this is all about making resources available. But then at the end of the day, people have to be willing to get it. To answer your question, though, yes, where we have a concern about someone's mental health, we have mechanisms, and yes, we've used them.
Okay, thanks.
So should we strike these?
I'm all for voluntary. I just have an issue with the word mandatory.
How about the
Yeah, I
group?
was going to make a suggestion. I know with employers that I've had before, they'll have incentive programs to like go to the gym, stop smoking, stuff like that. Is that something that we could do, where
Yeah.
instead of mandating counseling, there are incentives for getting counseling?
Again, the mayor's on this call. You can all speak to her about that. Those are contractual issues. And I'll just be very clear about what I mean when I say that, is that when you say incentive, that means money. And so far, many things, every single thing on this list you've said so far has a dollar value on it when I look at it.
Absolutely.
So, when you talk incentives, I'd love a fitness incentive. I'd love a mental health incentive. Not for me. I go to the gym for free every day. I work out in my basement 7 days a week, so I don't need to get paid to do that. But I would love to see officers get paid to maintain their physical and mental health. I think that if that would incentivize people to be more healthy either way, great. That said, we live in a tax cap world. So, I don't want to oversell the responsibility of the electeds in a sense that, they've got a very, very small amount of money to work with, and they're trying to do a lot of things with it. So these are all great ideas. Whether or not we afford them is another issue.
Right.
Well, I think we can put them in the plan and then, they'll have to decide what they pass and what they don't.
Mhm.
And I
I
believe-
don't think it's a bad thing. It's a negotiation with the PBA. The contract's in negotiation right now. They're 3-year contracts. I think that's what the chief means. And it's you could put these things in, but you would then also look to take other things off the table. So, there are many ways to do it, but I think as a recommendation, it's fine. I don't have a problem with this. It's just, it does come down to a sizable amount of money that either gets spent here or gets spent elsewhere in the community.
I have a question in terms of the money, right? So when the insurance would cover the mental health, why are we worrying about money coming out from the village for?
Because the village pays the insurance bill.
Right.
So somebody pays the insurance companies.
Okay,
Just like an employer, you have to pay for coverage, and these are high-risk individuals, right? So
Right.
we pay lots of insurance on everything, on the cars, on their lives, on their life insurance, on everything. It comes
Right.
out, the village pays for that.
And if we're
Your tax
talking,
office pays for that, yeah.
and if we're talking about support that's either support that's not provided through your insurance right now, or additional access that you aren't experiencing right now, that will have an impact on your insurance.
Generally, we have very good insurance and mental health is covered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Covered very
Yeah.
well.
It's
But the other
one of the
thing
best.
The other thing that's included here is it says incentive. So incentive means you're putting a cash value on people attending. So it's double whammy because number one, as a self-insured municipality, for every time a person goes to the doctor, the village gets the bill for that. And then we pay you for creating that bill. So, there's a real desire to balance that for, need versus just doing it for the sake of doing it. So you want everyone that needs medical and mental health care to get all the medical and mental health care that they can get. But, it certainly doesn't serve anybody to just send everybody to the doctor every week just to, if we got checkups every week, we'd be very, very healthy, but we'd bankrupt the municipality.
Can we mandate, like, for example, mental health wellness checks?
No, you can't mandate any checks. You can't mandate anybody to medical or mental health treatment unless you can get a doctor's order that somebody must go, must be taken into custody to be transported to a hospital for mental health.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking, that's a 730 form. No, we don't have the legal authority to do that. That's not just police officers, that's human beings in general.
If you have an employee assistance program with clearly delineated policies and rules regarding, a certain problem that has to be addressed and therapy can be a part of that, it can be a requirement as part of that employee assistance program, but it can't just be like every employee has to go get therapy every week kind of thing.
Right.
Right, but the most important part there is if there was an issue. Those are on a basis where if there's a problem with an employee, if you have a problem presents with a substance issue or mental health issue or a business issue, then we can mandate something like that as part of an EAP program. But we can't just say 61 employees, everybody goes to the doctor every week because we think that would be good for us.
Right.
Certainly.
It would be a wonderful world, but we can't do it legally.
Right.
So
if you had like a critical incident and you had an early intervention program that was the employee assistance program in this case, it could stipulate something like if they went to 2 calls or an officer involved shooting, then they would be required to go to attend a session of therapy. You could have that because that would be part of an employee assistance program. You just couldn't have it as like a catch-all. Everyone has to go to therapy every week.
I'll leave that to Labor Council to respond to.
Okay, he's not on. There's a lot of ways to incentivize physical issues, health and mental health issues as well, either directly or indirectly. What many departments are doing now is have a workout room in the police facility, and they get time off during their shift to do it. Clearly, that has an impact on their availability and potentially indirectly impacting operations as well. Some of the things like smoking cessation and other types of things are relatively low cost opportunities available to help somebody get better control of their lives.
So what I think we should do is Chief is correct that we cannot propose something that is against the law. That shouldn't be happening at all. So we should, however, then, say incentivize, these wellness checks, further than what has already been happening somehow. And, of course, if there's a monetary cost attached to that, that's something everybody needs to, the budget, the mayor, anybody else needs to analyze, but we can still propose it.
Yeah, money and degree of difficulty need to be recognized as we write up this plan, but it shouldn't stop us from saying that this should be a goal, even if it's long-term.
Right.
Chief, I have a question, if I may. For an officer that has excessive complaints or excessive incidents pertaining to situations that might not be above bar in terms of policy, is there any sort of mandatory wellness for a situation like that?
That was a very vague description, Kendall. So the answer to your specific question, no, because I can't just go off of an officer having a number of complaints and that triggering a need for counseling. This, like anything else, has to be, it doesn't require one complaint or all the complaints or any complaints at all. It's a review of people's behavior. And I can tell you that I've sent somebody for a fitness for duty examination who had no complaints. And sometimes complaints could be an indicator. Complaints being an indicator means that we're missing something internally. So I don't think we could, because complaints is way too broad. If you had complaints of a specific type, certainly we look at the complaints and say, does there appear to be a lot of aggression here? Could that be something that we could use towards that? Yeah, we could use something like that. Mm-hmm. It really depends on what the complaints are, which is the reason I kind of chuckled when I chimed back in. It depends on the circumstances. It's I don't mean to give you a vague answer to a vague question, but
right. I was more referring to aggressive behavior.
Yeah, I mean, look, if somebody's out on the road and they're displaying aggressive behavior that's concerning to us, first and foremost, I'm gonna hope that it should be caught here before it comes to a point where there's too many complaints that identify it. If the complaints help us identify something, then so be it. Then the complaints help us identify that. I don't believe you can mandate mental health based on, a metric like a number of complaints, but certainly based on the content of those complaints, which is why I'm saying that it can be no complaints, one complaint, or 4 complaints. The good news is it doesn't require those. The bad news is that they can't force it either.
Right.
Right. As long as it's specifically defining a certain set of criteria that, like the chief is saying, has to be really thought out in terms of what we're catching here. So, I mean, if the employee assistance program is saying, okay, if they have 5 complaints of excessive force within a 1-month period, that they have to receive some kind of mental health care, that can be the employee assistance program, and it can be a requirement.
We have somebody with 5 complaints of excessive force. We're long beyond an FFDE.
Yeah,
I'm just using an example. There are many departments that will have that kind of a requirement, but it has a certain time frame. Like, let's say 5 excessive force complaints in a month or 2 months, or something like that. I'm just giving kind of a broad example, but you can have that kind of specific requirement.
and even for something like excessive rudeness or something like that. So many complaints within a certain period of time, or getting people in anger management programs or something like that. Anything else on this topic?
Just before moving out of this section, I do not a surprise. I'd like to know what the proposal was regarding the ICE policy. I think that someone mentioned, because I'm sure that how does that impact this 4th recommendation here where it says to ICE, and how those work together.
Okay, let me show you what came out of that committee then. So under the Policies and Procedures Subcommittee, the suggested recommendation should that the department should modify or create a general order to say that Austining police officers will not respond with ICE unless they are called to a location where they have threat of violence or potential for violence. The policy should be adopted to reduce the appearance that OPD is working with ICE. And that's where we were coming from in the other section. And the new general order would not prohibit OPD from responding if there is a request because of violence or other issues, but it would clearly say that the relationship is not to co-respond or provide support unless there was risk of violence.
Question, Richard, with that, who's the call from? Is it like a standard call from a citizen, or like, I don't know how this works, Chief. I don't know at all. I have no personal, bias in that's back. But like, if ICE called, I'm not saying they have or haven't. So I'm just asking a general question. I don't know. If ICE calls that we're in the area, does that constitute a call for them to come out?
Yes.
Or does the call need to come from someone in the community as a citizen saying, we're concerned about something, this has happened, and then the police are responding to an issue as they would any other call that would come through dispatch or, through the regular switchboard?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Well, I mean, the point is to develop a general order that defines what your relationship is on these types of calls. So our thought was mostly that it would be a request from ICE because of a specific threat or violent situation, but it could be from the community as well.
I think this is an important distinction to get down, because are we saying that, in advance of ICE performing an action in the community, if they notify and say that they're in the area, does that then, according to this general policy, say that OPD can go and provide backup?
Or should go provide backup? And I don't know
So-
what they've done in the past.
I'm not okay with any part of this. I realize that it's an uncomfortable thing for people to hear that ICE is here. It is a fact of life. Our response is in direct response from community demand for information, because ICE does not share information. I'll tell you right now that I would be obligated to demand that some notification be made to the public that I'm against this, either from the village or I'd have to make some kind of statement in a meeting, because here's what's going to happen is when the calls of kidnappings come in, and then it's going to be, you stopped the wrong car because it fit the description of the kidnappers, which literally happened in those terms. We're going to be held responsible for that. We're going to be right back around on police reform, because the police department was put in the awkward position, the dangerous position of trying to answer calls of violence where ICE comes in under-identified, operating with no communications. I mean, the likelihood of catastrophe is through the roof, allowing a federal agency to come in and operate with no radio communications, with no knowledge of the community, no knowledge of the geography. We've already seen it happen. It happened on State Street. It happened on Prospect Avenue. It happens up on the hill and down on it. The reason we do what we do is to protect people. We're not backing them up. I've made that abundantly clear, and I'll continue to do that. If this is an issue of outreach and informing people, fine. But when bad things happen, it will not be my responsibility if we're prohibited by general order not written by me.
I don't think that's what this is saying. I mean,
Well, that's what it would be.
It's saying, first of all, it's saying that, getting back to the previous group of suggested recommendations, that there isn't clarity on what that relationship is, and there needs to be better outreach on the part of the police department to educate or inform the public on what that relationship is. And what this is saying is that this relationship should be in writing, that you're there for support, and that's
not what this says.
It is.
That's not what it says, that a policy should be adopted reducing the appearance. The new general order would not prohibit us from responding if there's a request. By the time there's a request from a cell phone, it's too late.
So, Chief, are you saying that when you all get wind the ICE shows up, even if no one has called, you show up anyway?
Here's what we do. We have negotiated with them different than every other agency in Westchester County, that when they come here, they tell us, so that we don't have the call of a kidnapping on State Street. They come to headquarters and they say, here's where we're going, here's who we're looking for. We follow them. We sit there, we watch. Last time we actually had to intervene because they came to us, they wanted us to impound a vehicle that would not have been legal. They were going to leave broken glass all over the road that would not have been legal. What did we do? We made sure the car was returned back to the family. We made sure the family knew where the person was going that was taken into custody. I've sat in our parking lot and helped people that were in custody make phone calls to make sure that their family was arranged for. We've driven their cars back to their homes. We've returned property. We've had contact with the school district to make sure that their families are cared for. We've contacted Feeding Westchester to make sure they're fed.
So then,
Those
Chief,
are the things we do.
so Chief, the question is this: we're on this call here, and we're part of the community. I've never heard you say it like that before.
I've done that at 4 or 5 different board meetings.
Right, but I mean, but okay, and it might be a case, it might be on the record, the board meeting, but if the general community, like when you say you negotiate to make sure that they come to you first, so they don't just run rawshot through the community, that's a whole different understanding than what most people think that you all are working with. Now, it can seem like that if you're following them, people get that perception. But if it's not in writing, that's on the website and the transparency and all those things, that's why I think you have a good heart with this, Chief. I'm saying from a community perspective, and it's not in writing, people don't know what it is.
No, I get that. I have no problem with the general order. I'm fairly certain we've published this on social media before. When we did it at public board meetings, it wasn't the ones that no one goes to.
I've seen this before.
Were full of people. But I mean, absolutely, there should be a policy, but this is a very clear statement that we should not be responding unless someone asks us to go there. And I'm telling you that the result of that is placing lives in danger and spreading worse misinformation than what we have right now.
Chief, is there an MOU with ICE? Is there like a 287G regarding this? No.
No, because what you're discussing there is deputization of local employees. That's not what we have. We don't do ICE work.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go on, Ian.
I just wanted some clarification of what that agreement is, in what form. You mentioned that you have an agreement with ICE in contrast with the other communities. Yeah.
So here's very specifically how that happened. They came here and picked up somebody on State Street that was reported as a kidnapping and took us all day to solve until we could find out it was them. The next week, they went and had a barricaded subject across the street from the then mayor's house, which turned into a regional news story. After that, we called the whatever person is in charge of ICE for like the entire tri-state area, and they sent 2 representatives who met here and agreed with us on a handshake basis to do this. It has worked out for the last 2 or 3 years in that format. So there is no written agreement with them. They could pull it tomorrow. They're a federal agency. They can come here whether we like it or not. And that's the thing that we keep telling people. We have no means of stopping ICE from coming here. They come whether they want to or not.
But this doesn't say that though.
I understand, but that also is something that people seem to believe at times. They've thought that we have some ability to prevent them from coming here. And it needs to
but that's where the public education needs to come in, Steve. That's what we're saying in the previous recommendation is that
But I'm going back to the part that says that we only respond if there's a request. And to answer the question that Ian had about whether or not there's an agreement, there is a handshake agreement and it's been held to all this time. But we do not
what is
have,
it?
Sorry?
My question is, what is that handshake agreement? Is it just that they will notify you
That they
when
come to
they're in
headquarters.
town, or is it that you will also follow them?
They allow us to follow. They can't stop us from following them. It's our police jurisdiction. They can't stop us from going anywhere we want to go. That's something we're going to do. The agreement is they'll tell us with the knowledge that we're going with them, because if they didn't want us going with them, then they would just say, we won't tell you. And they have no legal obligation to tell us that they're here. They can.
No, but the commanders could change and they got no legal obligation to stand by a handshake agreement either.
And
so
we would
I
have
think all we're saying is that you need to put it in writing what that
they won't sign it.
Right, but there's that expectation.
Your general order. I'm not talking about your written agreement.
I'm not arguing the general order. I'm agreeing. I think that it's fine to put it into general order. What I have a problem with is that it goes back to what you just took away from there was it said would not prohibit us from responding except for where there's a call of violence. That is very, very different than what we have right now.
I just took that out.
Well, because so you're saying that as part of the agreement, they'll notify you, and there's an expectation that you will accompany them to, or at least follow them to the location that they're conducting the activity.
Yeah.
Right. So what this is doing is changing that and saying that, or at least before that change was made, it's changing that and saying that you won't automatically follow them, that it would have to be on a request basis from.
Correct. That's what I'm objecting to.
Right. I'm just making sure everyone.
So So Chief, as we talked about this, I hate ICE, right? I equate them to horrible entities. So is there so what happens when with the immigrant community, Hispanic community, whatever you want to call it, when these circumstances happen, is that they immediately say, oh yeah, the cops were there, you know, they saw everything, they do anything, like what you said, because sometimes they think you have the power to stop that, or they say they were just, you know, either laughing there or they were helping, they were actively engaged and everything. And of course, what happens, like wildfire, this turns into OPD where there they were assisting, right? So what is, let's say we did something where you published the policy, exactly the why and everything. What is there a middle ground as to what to take that look, that scene, that for a very, you know, sometimes very uneducated populace that doesn't understand this, might not even know the language and all these things. What is a way that you can mitigate that it seems like you are working with ICE? Is there a way to do that?
Did you log on to Policia de Ossining yesterday?
I did.
There you go.
There's you know what, let's say 20,000 immigrant community members on this Facebook. There's going to be 7,000. What about the other 20,000 though? You know, I think it's something that doesn't live on
I can't knock
Facebook.
on the door of every single person in town, and certainly publishing a general order is going to hit far less people than social media does, because not many people enjoy reading general orders. How are we going to get this message?
Can I chime in? Can I chime into this, please, if you don't mind? It seems to me that we're at an impasse, okay, just from a structural meeting point of view. I'm hearing a couple of things. I'm hearing the pastor, and I'm hearing, I think it's Roe, that says, we believe what the chief is saying. The problem continues to be that the venues, the language, the understandings are simply not there. You could keep saying what you're saying, and you can even be right, and everybody on this call now maybe agrees with you, maybe. It doesn't matter whether they do now, but let's even assume that happens. It's still 15,000, 20,000, 10,000, as far as I'm concerned, 500 is enough, are just not going to get that. To many of this particular population, it seems to me that they have a view of the police, and this is a complicated issue, the leveling. This is a federal agency could go in anywhere they want, basically do what they want and leave when they want. That's essentially what a federal agency can do. The local police cannot do anything about that. On the other side is when the local police that our neighborhoods know about, not all of them, but they might relate to them, they're the same people. The local police has a uniform, and the federal police have some sort of uniform. So they look like they're the same people to them. So it's not just about optics. They really believe, and many of them come from countries, if I'm not mistaken, that where the police are actually state or national. So it makes sense that you could keep saying the same thing over and over again, but it's not getting to the people that need to hear it. So I heard the pastor say that he himself didn't know all this. I'm hearing, well, but from a meeting point of view, I think we're at an impasse. And I think at some point it is fair to say that there can be and I stay at arm's length in these conversations because I'm going to eventually have to be on the other side listening, synthesizing, then at some point voting. So I don't want to influence the content, simply the meeting, which says to me you're at an impasse right now. You can keep talking and understanding, I think it's good, but there needs to be a rule of engagement in this meeting that says if we have a bullet point that is at an impasse, what do we do? You may, and I think legitimately say that this is a very important point. We had some agreements and we had a disagreement. Not everybody's 100%, but it's important enough that we want to recommend it to the board to think about it and figure it out. And it seems to me you may want to do it on this point. I don't think it's a bad conversation. Don't let me stop the conversation, but I have been through this conversation and it may go on for quite a while. So I'm trying to say, what is the rule of engagement at this particular juncture in the meeting where a very important party says one thing, other parties say another, and they both want those points in this recommendation.
So I think that's a really good point, Mayor. And we remember this isn't the only point. This is 2 or 3 sentences here that makes a statement about the relationship between
Understood.
the police department and ICE. So the next step is a report, which brings some more substance behind the rationale behind this. So we've got another point to talk about this next week when we've got a draft report.
Can I just make a suggestion in terms of how we can get to bullet points that might be a little bit difficult or might extend discussion? Where there is a bullet point that might lead to more discussion, we can maybe have the 2 options that are going out, right? So the one before where we said we want to prohibit OPD from responding, and this one, and send out a survey after and see how many working committee members are in favor or not of which option, to see what we put in the report in the next meeting.
Or just as devil's advocate, actually putting in the report exactly what the 2 recommendations are, right? One of them stating, you know, some members of the committee thought, you know, kind of the way it reads like that. And then others, including the chief of police, because chief, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said you wanted to be on the record that you didn't agree with this, et cetera, you know, think that the policy should be, you know, I want to hear about those calls. I want to know if they're coming because of what might come. So provide those 2 scenarios, so then, you know, the village can make their decision, but provide exactly what the 2 recommendations could be.
Okay. I think that's a good point.
I like that suggestion to have the public comment on what they want.
Yeah.
I just want to make one point about this that I don't think quite came up while we were having this conversation. I joined a lot of the community calls on this, and this came up in, I think, all 3 of the ones that I joined. So this is not something that just the Hispanic community is concerned about. It's and is confused about. The entire Austining community, it seems like, is not clear on what the policy is. So it is public education that needs to happen, and it should be pretty broad, because it's not just a small piece of the community that isn't aware of what exactly the relationship is. A lot of people had that question.
Okay. Shall we move on? You want to, I think we were done with internal operations since we're on 3 policies and procedures. Let's stay here for a bit. So John couldn't be here today. He's unavailable today and tomorrow. So I'll take over his 2 committees, which he dealt with. So the first one was to put policies online. That's a transparency issue, which could have been in the other subcommittee that is increasingly being done by police departments all over the country. That's a relatively short-term change that could be made without a lot of resources being expended to do that. Some of the things that are coming up here would take longer term because it's an internal process within the department. I think as we talk more about transparency and community involvement, it's a broader discussion. But and also in the draft report, John is doing an assessment of key policies that could benefit from an examination of reducing potential for bias and directing it to bias-free kinds of policy and language in them. So a thorough review of policies and procedures with that kind of eye is part of the recommendation, but as an appendix or something in the report, we're going to give you our thoughts about where those changes should be made. And then apart from the ICE recommendation, develop a policy requiring reporting of misconduct by department personnel. Which is common in most departmental policies and procedures. Any comment from the members of the committee on the other recommendations here?
I just want to comment. We feel pretty strongly about the bias-free policy, policing policy, because it's generally done now as best practices to flow throughout the all of the policy and procedures, so that it will always be remembered and reminded of as people read the policies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we really did look at every single policy and came up with little language that would make it anti-racist and no bias, and more inclusive when necessary. There's a couple that we have to look at where the version that we got was had been updated. So we do have to look at about 3, I think. It was a lot of reading though, people. A lot of reading, right, Mary?
Gabby's right. Gabby, you're breaking up a little bit, but there was something like 150 policies you guys went through.
Yes, it was a lot of reading, but we got it done. So it's all good.
Yeah.
That's really good though, that there's 150 policies and there's 5 points. That means that all the policies that should be there and the way they're worded are there, and that's a good thing.
Well, two of the points are kind of general, but yes, I accept your point.
I have a question regarding 3 and 4. I'm sorry, 2 and 3. The department should adopt a bias-free policy, a policing policy. Is that to say that the department does not have a bias-free policing policy at this point? And also, part 2 to that question is about question 3. The department should adopt an anti-racist / bias-free language in policies to guide policing or community contact. Is that to say that at this point, the department does not have anti-racist, bias-free language in the policies? I'm not clear on those particular subjects.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. That's a good point. Almost no department does, because most policies are created to the policy manual over a period of time, and some of them are quite old. Unless you've got some comprehensive approach to reviewing policy. With that, and obviously with the events of the last year, this is a lot more critical, receiving a lot more focus from departments around the country. So it's saying that there are policies that could benefit from a bias-free perspective.
So basically, due to the fact that these policies are very, very old, they wouldn't address biased and racist issues. Is that what?
Wait. I'm sorry. No, they do.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Hang on a second. Yeah, we did look at them. So they do have, the bias-free workplace. They have all those policies, but to, zhuzh them up and to also make it a little more kind of throughout. Because, when you're then talking about employment, like how you're hiring people, how you're promoting people, and, so we basically went through everything and looked at, not a huge thing, like 1 or 2 sentences. And if you edit this, this would make it, best practice.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Ian, do you want to go next on oversight and governance, and we'll go back to hiring at the end?
Okay. So our subcommittee, we looked at 3 main topic areas. First being oversight, so mainly looking at the CPCRB and its function and role. 2, looking at governance. So how is the police department governed ultimately in terms of is the village board serving as police commissioners, all their alternatives, et cetera. And then finally, transparency. So transparency, not just in terms of policies, but also looking at how does the department report on what it's doing, its activity of certain types, such as arrests, vehicle stops, positive interactions, et cetera. and how that breaks down demographically. So beginning with oversight, we began with looking at really a lot of research on best practices for civilian complaint review boards, best practices in terms of how they're composed, how they're structured, the types of powers they have. There's a number of different forms throughout this country. Certainly in the last 10 years or so, and definitely within the last 6 months have gained additional prominence, but number of different forms. And because the concept has kind of been around for a while, there's been significant opportunity to kind of gauge, the effectiveness of different systems, as some have kind of failed and have been replaced either through voter referendum or administrative action. And so there's been quite a lot of opportunity to see kind of what works and what doesn't work. So the first suggested recommendation that we came up with is involving the composition of the board. So for it to function, the CPCRB to function as an oversight board, an external means of oversight to looking at complaints. Our suggested recommendation is that the police department not have those two spots with two alternates on the board, because otherwise it kind of defeats the purpose in a sense of having an external oversight board if the police department itself is on that board. So, and this is in keeping with virtually every civilian oversight board that exists in America to not have representatives from the police department directly on the board as voting members. I mean, certainly, the police department is part of presenting their case and part of the review process, but to be a part of the voting process, it's important for this to be a board that's trusted by the community and one that the community sees as being legitimate in terms of it being an external oversight board. So it would be a total of 5 seats, no alternates, and it would require a simple majority vote. So second, this was changes to definitions of unfounded and unsubstantiated. So when a complaint is given, the police department investigates and determines whether or not the complaint is substantiated and that whatever was alleged happened and could be shown in it, and it represented a breach of policy or other regulation. It could also be unfounded in that it, based on the available evidence, whether it's 911 records, whether it's testimony, whether it's body camera footage, determined that it didn't happen. Like if someone made a complaint that an officer said something, on a certain day, and then it was determined based off of that officer's activity that they were never at that address, that they never came into contact with that person, that would be unfounded because it was proven to show that it did not happen. Unsubstantiated meaning that the actual material of the complaint that was going to be a breach of policy or regulation was not found to constitute a breach of policy or the regulation. So the idea was that the way that the definitions are written to the village code in terms of the CPCRB's role don't really kind of convey what that means. And so not changing the spirit of the law or the intent of the definition or really ultimately how the definition functions, but just having that definition be more clear so that there isn't confusion among the board as to what the different categories mean. Thirdly, consideration should be given to hiring an outside investigator. So currently, the police department is investigating the complaint. Peekskill has a system where they have an outside investigator that's hired, retained by the village to investigate these complaints that are submitted before the Civilian Complaint Review Board. Terrytown recently has decided to move in that direction as well. So
one quick correction there. Both Peekskill and Terrytown's review boards are in development, but
okay.
Peekskill, it sounded like, had already made that decision, and Terrytown is considering it.
Okay, got it. Okay.
And one more correction, just semantic. Peekskill is not a village.
Okay.
Peekskill is actually a city. There's differences, and there is actually a lot of legal entity differential between cities, and we're a village.
Certainly, yeah. We will make that correction. So,
how many? Since you guys did the research, just in addition to Ossining and I guess Peekskill, how many Peekskill is the city, how many villages in Westchester actually have a civilian police review board?
I don't have the statistic. Jennifer,
Oh,
do you have
We're
any
the only
idea?
ones, I think we're the only ones that have one that already exists. The reason that I know about Peekskill and Terrytown developing them is because they reached out to ask opinions about how ours are working.
Yeah, I agree.
right. I get a lot of calls like that, so it's actually a surprise to me. Not to say that there isn't best of class across the country that are being looked at, which I think is terrific, but I just wanted to get just like some clarity. I get a lot of calls too, and there aren't that many of them, surprisingly, right now, but they're in development, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
So
But
thank
also-
you. It was just a question.
I would also say this, that there are many, maybe outside of Westchester, that have civilian review boards, but don't have subpoena power. And so they're all different types of complaint review boards. And so, we commend Austin for being ahead of the curve. We just want to improve what we're already doing.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and there's stuff to learn from around the country. We don't have to just look at Westchester. There might be some great village, some other place that's got a great idea. That's the whole point of bringing people together. I think it's fabulous.
Right, and so with this scenario, there would likely be some opportunities to kind of like, in terms of the cost of this being shared among different villages and cities, where you could have among all Westchester cities and villages that have some type of review board having a shared kind of civilian investigator. And so this outside investigation would be done in parallel to the OPD investigation. So they would both be investigating at the same time. So fourthly, a couple of procedural changes to how the CPCRB functions. So currently the village council does now attend every meeting. If not the village council, then the village council deputy or deputy village council. So this would be actually codifying it and writing it into the village code, that this is in the same sense that the village council is at every village board meeting, that they would be in attendance at every CPCRB meeting, whether it's the village council or the deputy village council. Secondly, recusal. If a CPCRB member has a conflict of interest, such as if they are directly related to a police department employee. Next, virtual and hybrid meetings. So it was commonly echoed that it's a real positive that there is the option now to attend virtually. Certainly that's how they're conducted now, and that even in the future post-COVID, because this kind of broadens the opportunity for engagement among a wider spectrum of community, that even if there is physical meetings taking place, that the option to attend them virtually be retained. And lastly, that the meeting, which in the past at times had been held at the police department, certainly not always, but having in the future, so that just for the sake of it being fully external and independent from the police department, to have it be at a village property, whether it's rec center or any other location, as long as it's not the police department's property. So some changes to CPCRB review timelines. So changing the maximum length of complaints from being a limit of 90 days, changing that to be 120 days. Then specifying that the investigation must begin within 10 days of the complaint being filed, and that it will complete within, it says 30 minutes, but that would be impossible, 30 days unless additional time is required. And the police department can do that by submitting justification for that in writing, that specifies, okay, this is why we can't complete this investigation, X, Y, Z, and then it's automatically given. So right now, the village code identifies that there's a series of training modules that need to be completed for each new board member or each new CPCRB member that joins. So before they can hear any case or vote on any case, they have to complete these 11 different things. Some of them are very general and kind of deal with more kind of constitutional issues like arrests, use of force policies, et cetera. Whereas others are very specific to certain types of cases, like say domestic violence, for instance. So this can take a while to do. And so to kind of speed this up and make it so that the board can still really function and be able to replace new members effectively and efficiently, that it be made so that there's a core set of trainings that's just use of force, vehicle stops, and constitutional issues, civil rights issues that are the core training, that those three need to be completed before that member would be able to review or hear or vote on any complaint cases. But that the remainder of that training, the other 8, would still need to be completed, but they could still vote and hear a case before they completed that. And so if it was a complaint relating specifically to domestic violence, it would be expected that if they hadn't had the domestic violence training, for instance, that they recuse themselves until they get that training, but by and large, able to hear the vast majority of complaints. So lastly, making a change so that right now, the CPCRB doesn't hear complaint cases where they're either the OPD employee involved or the complainant that's involved, that made the complaint rather. If they're the subject of a criminal investigation, that it never goes to the CPCRB. So the change here is that the CPCRB would still be made aware of and get the complaint and be able to review it, since certainly these are independent processes that can and do operate independently from one another. That,
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was the end.
it is, yeah.
I've got some questions. So we're sitting here and we're in a minute going to talk about needing more training to be a cop. And then we're going to say you can get less training and hear a complaint as to whether to suspend a cop though.
The idea is that there are certain types of cases that, or rather some of the training is very specific to certain case types, like the requirement that domestic violence training be given to the CPCRB members before they vote on any type of case. Instead, changing it so that if the case has nothing to do with domestic violence, that member may still be able to hear a different type of case that doesn't involve that. So right now, the problem is that because this is a civilian complaint review board, this isn't a professional organization where people are full-time CPCRB members. For this to really function and be able to kind of replace new members as attrition occurs, that it is too onerous to have a series of 11 separate trainings that are often difficult to schedule and provide in kind of a condensed, timely manner.
But when we're talking about onerous, we are talking about people's livelihoods and employment here, and some of these are life and death scenarios. So,
certainly.
I mean, I think I don't want to speak on behalf of the union, but I mean, to say that it's not important to go through training, the totality of understanding all of the trainings that are required under the CCRB are to give a broad perspective of all of the different things you deal with in policing. And I understand that you haven't done this job, but it would be impossible to just bifurcate the responsibilities of a cop and say, well, you learn traffic stops, so you know it. You don't. And to say that you're going to give somebody the authority to judge whether or not I get suspended, I lose my job, I face charges, and say that you only have to go through 25% of the training and we'll get to the rest when we get to it. I mean, again, the irony of eliminating training while we mandate additional training for cops is just striking to me.
Well, we'll also remember that, this ultimately goes to the village board anyway for the recommendation that's made, and village board isn't getting, any training in these kinds of areas. So this is a civilian committee.
But the recommendation is made, and that recommendation carries quite a bit of weight.
Right. And so the idea is that they are, the training is mandated in areas that pertain to the case that they're investigating. That if they're hearing a case that involves domestic violence, they have to have had all that training on domestic violence as well as all the core training. It's just saying that if they've had the core training and the case doesn't involve that specific area, they could hear a different type of case where that training isn't pertinent.
Let me say this, Chief, hold on real quick. Chief, hold on. The spirit behind this, let me say this. It was not to say that CCRB members should not get training. They automatically need training and they should continue to have it. What took place recently was that we had a whole brand new committee, and it took them almost, 3 to 4 months to get all the training through, and there were complaints that were still being piled up, not being heard. So
that's because community members failed to complete the training or failed to volunteer for the board. We've had people for 20 years sign up and want to complete the training. Now, I mean, you can't take a cop and say, hey, we'll teach you how to drive a car, shoot a gun, and here's how to do a traffic stop, and you can only do traffic. That would be incredibly reckless. But yet there's a rush to get people to hear complaints about the activities that cops do. And we say, we'll get to the training, we get to the training. I'm not aware of any job on earth where you go through 25% of training, and then we get to the rest when we get to it, because we just really want you to be able to do this job.
We're not
So
saying
just
that we're not saying that the core training, that they can make a determination of any kind without the core training that talks about their authority and the process. We're talking about the subject matter expertise in some kinds of cases, which can be looked at in isolation.
But cops don't, so when we say core training, that's a made up phrase.
No,
Because
it's not, because
cops don't
actually
get
in the
core
current
training.
I'm sorry, Chief. In the actual current, there is listed out core competency training and then additional training that's listed out. That's not new.
But that's fabricated. That's not a real thing. We don't tell cops, here's your core training, and the rest of it is electives.
CCRB. We're not just referring to cops training. We're talking about civilian persons who provide that level of aspect.
But these are folks that are going to judge whether or not I lose my job.
and the training will all happen within 6 months. But at the same time, we need to be able to be.
In the meantime, you get to hear a complaint and decide whether or not I lose my job.
And if I'm reading a complaint that has nothing to do with domestic violence, why can't I make a judgment on that?
On something like Officer Rude.
Then why should I send cops to domestic violence if they're only going to do traffic stops?
So the reality is that, Chief, the record reflects that almost the majority of any reports that have actually been reviewed have been unsubstantiated or have had nothing. So I hear what you're saying.
It's not about the past. This is about each one. This is about due process, which is what we're here to meet about. It's about treating people fairly and giving them a right to be heard. And what we're saying is we're going to give some training and say good luck to you, and we'll get to the rest, because we're in such a rush to judge you that we're not even willing to go through all the training. And sure, so you're hearing about a traffic stop and it's not about domestic violence. There is a totality to this job. There's a reason that we say that cops need to be trained in 100 different topics, because training somebody very narrowly does not give them the perspective of the whole job that we do. This is a very, very fluid environment that we work in. And again, it doesn't matter if what the past judgments have been. Those are past judgments. I have to worry about what happens tomorrow. And this is about people's livelihoods and careers. And what you're talking about is giving the authority for somebody to recommend termination with 25% of the training.
And then the board.
We need to be able to balance the needs of the complainant and the needs of the police officers. We absolutely do not want to be unfairly judging the police officers, but we also need to be able to make sure that the CCRB is able to do its job. It's appointed to do a job. This year, we were not.
If you can't do the
we
training,
were not reviewing complaints for several months this year because of this situation. And you said yourself that
because the board was eliminated last year, and that's something you can argue with the previous village board. The fact that they wiped the board clean and replaced everybody at the same time, and in the middle of a pandemic tried to schedule everybody for training, and through nothing short of a Herculean effort that our officers scheduled training like every week to go through these things. So this is not on the police department, the fact that that board got turned over. We didn't do that. And that also, if you want to talk about past, that's an unlikelihood that they're going to turn over a whole board. Ordinarily, you remove one person a year or two people a year, and then those folks have to go through training.
Right.
But are we sitting here saying that training is important to us as a committee, or are we saying that training is not important to us as a committee? Because I hear on one hand that we really—
I think there are very different responsibilities
to the CCRB.
There are very different responsibilities between somebody who is judging what has happened and the people who are actually out there dealing with the public.
That's not different responsibilities. That's different standards. What you're talking about is a different standard for the person going on the call versus the person judging whether or not they lose their job for how they behaved.
We are not making the determination of who is losing their job and who is not. We are making
but you're making a
recommendation.
recommendation that goes forward to the board that will carry quite a bit of weight.
As does your recommendation.
And if you're aware that the staff member who are making the recommendation don't have the qualifications for a unique circumstance, then you can certainly bring that up at that time. That would be a unique circumstance. But generally speaking—
Well, we wouldn't know that because we're not allowed to go, but that's a whole other issue. But
Well, but
the
you,
bottom line here is, again, I'll go back to, we don't train cops for 25% of the job and call them good. You must get the full array of training to get the whole perspective of what you face. There is no such thing as a police call that's only one aspect. We don't go on just a domestic violence call that's only domestic violence. We don't do traffic stops that are just traffic stops. Everything has multiple layers to it. That's the reason we're sitting here right now, is because people for years have not acknowledged the depth of doing police work. And right now we're saying, oh, don't worry about it. We'll judge you based on this very small amount of training we get without bothering to complete all the rest of the requirements. But yet we will still have the authority to make a recommendation that you lose your job with these 3 hours of training.
Okay, but let's remember that if there is a disagreement, and only if there is a disagreement between your recommendation and our recommendation, the village board hears from both of us and questions both of us.
And yet without the proper training, you've already made that recommendation and placed it in front of the village board, where a person is now on trial for their career because you couldn't go through the training.
Well, everything that goes.
I think we're making a big assumption.
I'm sorry.
We're making a very big assumption here.
It's not. It's written in black and white. It says, really? Because I'm fairly certain that the CCRB hasn't completed all the training that's required right now. And you're
Yes,
hearing
we have. We spent months completing that training before we could review any complaints.
And
That's what this came
the
out of.
assumption I'm not making is, it says right here, finish the core training and then be responsible for all the rest of the training within 6 months. That means in the 6 months between the time when you finish what you refer to as core and the other stuff that seemingly is less important, you have the authority to hear a complaint on what you judge to be relevant to that training that a person may lose their job over without going through the rest of the training.
I would say that this is similar to what Rika said before. It seems to be an issue that we're not going to have an agreement on. So I think that we should, as in the other policy, we should put this forward as something where there's a disagreement on it and keep it moving.
So I also have a question. I also didn't sit on this policy. I really would like to know if there was any consideration as to a code of conduct for CCRB members. For instance, if you had a member who was known to be involved in some sort of bad activity associated with any sort of criminality, exhibiting bias, racist tendencies, anti-Semitism, anything of that sort. As of right now, there is no regulation on the behavior of CCRB members. So I think that there should be something put in place. Likewise, I know that there are some privacy considerations in terms of information that they're given, and there's no requirement, or there is a requirement rather, that they don't disclose anything. However, there's no consequence written into this. So I would love to see a code of conduct for CCRB members and some sort of penalty for bad behavior, or an ability to remove people if we find out that somebody is ill-fitting for the board based on, again, what we're talking about here. We want to put anti-racist policies in, we want anti-bias policies in. If we find out we've got all those things, I think that that should extend to everybody in village government.
Yes, of course.
I agree with that.
That's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds fair. I do also want to.
I don't know what the
is.
request. Well, excuse me. I don't know what the request is right now. We're talking about volunteers, and if the request is that this particular committee have some sort of a code of conduct, and what the consequences are. First of all, anybody can be removed by the board because it's actually a mayor's appointment. So anybody could be removed if they're proven to be X, Y, and Z, whatever. Is the request that there be a code of conduct about this across all dozen or so boards, or is the request for this specific board? That's what I'm not clear about.
I only interact with this board, so that's the only thing we were talking about here today. So if the village board intended to spread that across all volunteer boards, that's fine. I mean, Rika, I think you know where I'm coming from on this one. We talked about this already, so I think that's important. Yep. And there's one more thing that I had just forgotten to bring up too. There's no element of standing.
Excuse me, one second, Chief. So let's finish the statement. We discussed it and you and I were in disagreement about something. So I don't want anybody walking out of this, which is a recorded meeting, to hear it as we discussed and we were in agreement.
No,
yes,
no,
we
simply
did
that
discuss.
I shared.
I know exactly what it is, but we're not in agreement about this. So I don't want people walking away to think that we are in agreement. What I'm trying to understand is very clearly, is the request that for this particular board, as a matter of recommendation, which makes sense to me in this board, but you all need to think about it, that whether you are recommending as a committee that the volunteer members, if they show some bias or whatever, and how you would measure that. So do you do background checks on the volunteer committee? Is it them? Is it something they've said in the past? When you talk about things like this with volunteers, I just urge that you don't just say, yeah, I get it, but actually think about what's being asked. If you want this board to have it, then you have to think about implementation. It may not be in this specific conversation. It may be simply a recommendation that says, it would seem to us that this board should have, let's say, background checks, or should have something
That's already
in
part
line
of
with
the
people
code.
who are making, right. So that's for this board. The board of trustees will then have to decide whether there's equity in making one board have a standard that other boards may or may not. It may say, sure, that's okay, because those other boards don't make these kind of decisions. But I just think that it should be put in some context.
So very specifically what I'm asking for, because we're not here to talk about any other board, I'm asking for some sort of code of conduct that relates to this board that would allow for, if something were to turn up on a background check that makes somebody, that would indicate a bias, that would indicate racist tendencies, anti-Semitism, criminal affiliation, all of those things that would make them ineligible to sit on the board. If the village board wanted to extend that to everybody, then I think that's great. I mean, it's sort of in the vein of what we're talking about here anyway, but I don't think it would be appropriate for me to make a request that something go out to the zoning board in this meeting.
Well, there already is a criminal record check, correct, on new
Yes.
board members, correct?
Yeah, no, but what I said wasn't necessarily this criminal behavior, but there's criminal association. For instance, if you had somebody who was gang affiliated, might seem strange to some, but that would be something that would raise an eyebrow in a civilian complaint review board, right? It would raise an eyebrow in any board you'd sit on. So
Are you suggesting that the village board of trustees would nominate someone to the CCRB who has a gang affiliation?
I'm suggesting that if there's anybody that exhibits tendencies such as racism, bias, anti-Semitism, any sort of criminal affiliation, then I think those people should be prohibited from going there. It doesn't exist right now. It says there's a background check. It doesn't say anything about what's found after that's done.
So I mean, are we suggesting that if someone is nominated to be on the board, that, I mean, essentially a thorough background investigation of, you know, that person's, you know, social media past, you know, et cetera, is conducted? Because what that would entail would be a pretty significant effort on the part of the police
Like
department, correct?
police officer background check.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
I think
currently, social media backgrounds are not legally allowed to be used to hire people, for example.
Right.
So you would have to, you can make the recommendation, but it goes back to an hour ago about whether things are illegal or not, and whether they're implementable or not, right? Because people do have constitutional rights. And there is whether you as an individual do something, or whether you're associated to somebody who may do something.
Right.
Those are two different issues, and they're constitutional issues, actually.
Right.
Yeah, and I should point out that as the code currently exists, you're not eligible to be on the board if you have if you've been convicted of a crime. So if a criminal background check turns something up, then there would be a consequence. You would be removed from the board because you're not eligible.
I understand that. That's clearly established there. I'm talking about all the rest of the things. We're putting in anti-racist and anti-bias policies for the police department. I think it should be, that really should apply to everybody and everything.
Right, but what does that actually entail? Like you suggesting?
I guess the same
like
thing as whatever we're implying, whatever we're implementing for the cops. I mean, how do you designate anybody as racist or biased, right? I mean, there's a metric that's going to have to be established. So once it's there, fair to use for everybody, right?
Already there.
I mean, it's going to be
measuring whether there's bias in the police. I thought that we were just adding in anti-bias training.
No, there was written into the policy recommendation.
Are we changing? Yes.
Yeah, it's written in. It's in the policy recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
yes, it's in the policy recommendations.
Yeah, it's a challenge for everybody because it's something that you can't put a ruler up to. But I think it's one of those things that you might know it when you see it.
I think this quickly kind of becomes a pretty complicated thing, and with that part of it still not fully fleshed out in terms of, you know, the collective bargaining component, whether or not that violates labor laws, various other laws. I think that all kind of needs to get sorted out before we're stipulating that that is a process that is also burdened upon the people joining the complaint review board.
So I just had one other recommendation for this that doesn't exist. It really should have been edited in years ago. There's no requirement for standing here. So right now, and we've had this actually come up a couple of years back, the CCRB right now is permitted to hear complaints from people with no direct knowledge of an incident whatsoever. So you don't have to be the complainant yourself. You don't have to be a witness to the event. You can just have heard something happened and it fits within the code. So there really should be something, although there's a timing. So you can be the victim yourself and you can be time barred, but you can be somebody that was in another town at the time an incident happened. And as long as you're timely, the complaint goes forward. So there really should be something to address standing, like there would be in any other civil or criminal complaint.
Well, if I was, yeah, I mean, there are a number of considerations to think about here. Like, let's say I witnessed, you know, some event where I thought excessive force was used. The person who that was, go ahead.
No, that's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to people that have no firsthand knowledge of it whatsoever. A witness is somebody who saw something. I'm talking about people that weren't even present.
I think that's pretty common in other police departments, policies on this in many communities. Anonymous complaints.
No, not anonymous. I'm talking about unconnected.
Well,
These
I
are
know.
literally had a
You don't know
complaint
that
from
they're
someone.
connected if they're anonymous, and they can still be followed up.
No. But anonymous
Family
is written.
members, friends who saw something that maybe the person who could have been the person who filed a complaint wasn't willing to, but
Not that, Richard.
somebody else was.
Someone says, I heard something happened. Hearsay, literal hearsay.
It's not necessarily just extending to that though, because I mean, like you're just saying with an anonymous complaint, where maybe the person who's directly involved in it or witness to it doesn't feel comfortable filing that complaint and has someone else do it, who literally, as you're putting it, would have just heard about it, and that the person who didn't feel safe making the complaint asked them to make it for them. That would bar that person from making that complaint.
So we're going to accept you making a complaint from California about something that happened here, having never set foot here.
Their departments.
Are you
Still
implying
doing evidence. There's a whole investigation that happens. That's probably going to be found to be unfounded. So,
but again, we go back to you'll probably be okay. Could you imagine if we ran the civil and criminal courts on a basis of you'll probably be okay?
This isn't a civil or criminal court.
And exactly, and that's the problem, is it's not being treated with any reasonability compared to anything else on earth. I mean, you're looking at it and you're going, you can just say you had a premonition that something happened and we're going to entertain that. And your best defense is going to be, you'll probably be okay.
Isn't that an issue?
I think you're extending this in a way that it could theoretically be happen, but much more likely it's going to be a complaint from a family member or a friend on behalf of someone who didn't want to.
You're leaving the door open to something that, although unlikely, I have seen happen. And although it's not your career that's on the line, you're entitled to due process. But what you're saying is, I'm not, but you'll probably be okay. That's not right.
I mean,
it's also not right to not allow a complaint to be filed if a person feels intimidated out of making a complaint.
Right.
Are you implying that it should not be reviewed because it was hearsay or because the person was from somewhere else? Like, I could have a family member from New Jersey tell me something that happened to them with a police officer. They might be undocumented, and so I go and make the complaint. Should they not review that because I was told about what happened?
Correct. We should not entertain complaints from people who didn't see it, didn't hear it,
So if you're not entertaining it, right, you're not working with the community, which means you're saying that it's not important enough and that the complaint is not important enough.
No, we're saying the due process
exactly
requires somebody to make. No, that's not what I'm saying. And you cannot.
This is not a legal court.
Something different. And that's the problem, is that you treat it as something other than the rest of America. You're saying due process does not matter in this realm because that's the
process. There's an entire investigation that happens. There's evidence that we look at all the evidence that exists If there's
complaining that they're not
evidence
getting
that
trained,
the
they're
complaint
getting
is
all the
founded,
training.
then it's going to be found to be unfounded.
And when your complainant is not present, not participating, and all you have is a third party who says, I heard it, we'll just hope that that person lets their story go, because it's going to just be what they say then.
Well, no, because then a follow-up investigation will talk to people who did experience it. That's what departments do around the country.
And best of luck to you, because we'll just let people call from another state and just report things whether they're true or not.
But departments in other parts of the country are doing that.
Yeah.
So this is not novel. It's best practice. We should always strive for best practice. I have to say, Chief, I'm really discouraged by the way you're interacting with us about this today. And I'm not happy in this conversation. And, I really think that you're being defensive. You're taking everything like really defensively, and you're not really open to hearing the feedback that we have. Even if you have legitimate concerns or questions, I don't think the way you're framing it is professional today.
I'm sorry
really, I
you
don't.
feel that way,
Yeah.
but the reality here is that you're talking about taking complaints from people who are no contact to an incident that occurred.
Other places do
saying
it that way, though. Other places do it that way. The fact that we don't do it that way doesn't mean that if we take that other model, that we're doing something wrong.
So 45 police departments in Westchester County have no CCRB, but yet we're not following that model. We're doing this one. So I have a hard time in policing going with sometimes it's best because everybody else does it, and other times it's best because they don't.
But in this case, it's best because it's aids transparency and police officer actions.
So just to be clear, anybody can say anything they want. There's no consequence to them, and we'll just entertain it because that's the best practice.
Yes. If you
Cool.
want to be sarcastic about it, yes.
It's not. That's literally the answer.
We're going
I
to
need
have
to make sure we're being
investigations, and
clear.
we're going to find out what's going on. And then many times it'll be unfounded, but sometimes you might find something that you would not otherwise have been exposed to.
Exactly. And it's our job to weed through all those bullshit. Excuse me.
Can I chime in, please? And I will apologize. I will jump off in 4 minutes. I have a session after this. Let me make a suggestion here and somebody should mute themselves because we're hearing a conversation beyond what's going on here. Here's the thing. This is a citizen volunteer committee, and by citizen, I mean a resident of the village of Ossining. It is a group of volunteers whose purpose it is not to fire people, not to get rid of people. It is actually the contrary, in my opinion. It is a group of people whose core premise has to be not understanding every law, not understanding what every cop does, not understanding what every civilian does, but rather to go into this when we appoint them, when we interview them with the understanding that it is their desired outcome on behalf of the community to have some oversight, a third-party oversight to a police force to make sure that they hear complaints and that people who live in the community have a place to complain about police officers who are in powerful positions, and that they do it with people whose intention it is not to make people lose their jobs, okay? But rather to make sure that if there's a legitimate complaint of something atrocious happening, something evil happening, something unprofessional happening, something ugly happening, really more on the extreme than just a simple act, that there is a place and a space for people to bring that forth, and those people have the intention of the last thing they want to do is have somebody get fired. I've been in this for 5 years, Sir Trustee. I have never heard of anybody that sits and goes, I really want to get cops fired. Okay, that's not the intention of these committees. They spend a lot of their time, learning about the police, a lot of time reading the policy. The intention is that people get a fair shot in a fair space, both the police and a complainant. And it is not fair to position this committee as if they're the begin, the middle, and the end, okay? It is unfair to the Board of Trustees to imply that they take recommendation and just stamp them through. There was a question to have an attorney present, a corporation counsel that is actually there to give legal advice. That corporation counsel, or anyone, whether it's Stuart Kahan currently or anybody else that's hired, if they feel that something goes a little bit off, their job is to let the committee know, and I believe that every lawyer would do that and said, let's get a little bit more investigation, let's get a different opinion, let's call. Let's also remember that the police themselves are in a collective bargaining unit. Not only do they have contracts, they have multiple rights to have investigations done themselves, to go to a higher authority, to have a lawyer come in, to speak to their chief, to do all sorts of things. They have rights. All this is a volunteer group of people who want to take their time, not get anybody fired, not take out any personal agendas, in my opinion, and I'm stating my opinion. They're appointed, and when they're interviewed for these positions, there is an interviewing process. We can sit here all night and discuss whether the Board of Trustees chose all exactly the right people and whether any Board of Trustees does. But again, this is a foundation of a democratic system. And these are people who represent the community and take their personal time. This is not what they get paid to do. On the contrary, they're very dedicated to what they're doing. So I do think that continuously throwing it out there that, you know, they need to do 101 things and go through 101 hurdles because they're in charge of either firing a police officer or not. There are many levers in place. This is one lever amongst many in place to protect the rights of the police, to protect the rights of complainants. And in the middle, they're not judges. They're recommending based on their knowledge. And there's attorney, which I see was one of the things, but there has been actually this year all along, sitting in the middle to make sure that the law, the rule of law, is managed. What I hear is a bit of an obstacle about training and all that is not an all or nothing being described by either party. It is that somewhere there has to be the right amount of training. What exists currently is way over the top, to be realistic. And what maybe this committee wants, maybe the chief you think is not enough. But I will tell you that having sat on this committee 2 or 3 years ago, as a person who works for a living full time, the way that was set up, it's simply not realistic to have volunteers spend those kind of hours. And for the people on the committee, I am not sure that we have the right number of hours, because you could argue that it is so many hours that you would need. Other people may argue, no, it isn't, actually. There are plenty of people who can look at a complaint about something with the intention of finding a fair answer and make a recommendation, and within that recommendation, have an attorney present, and within that say, are we within the rights? Can we explain where we're coming at it? And then another group of people spends time looking at it. And so there are many levers here. It's not an all for nothing. And I think that's what's being discussed here. And I do think it's something that, again, from a process point of view, the consultants Matrix might want to say with a footnote that the chief of police disagrees with it or not, or that's 2 or 3 people. But I do think that this can go on all night about the right amount of things. And I do think that we might want to sort of move on. And I'm not trying to pressure the committee. I'm just trying to step back a little bit and say, we know going in, this is a sensitive topic, but I do think this all or nothing kind of scenario is an unfair scenario to the people who are sitting on some of these committees and how they're appointed. And I do have to state that and really sort of be clear about that.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate those points. Okay, well, we'll find some way to qualify this. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
So next area is governance.
Yep. So here so currently the village board functions as the police commissioners, in that they're ultimately the ones with the hire and fire capability, the ones ultimately in charge of, from a governance perspective, of the police department. So the suggested recommended change here is to instead transfer that role to a new board that would be comprised of 5 community members and up to 2 Board of Trustees members. So there are a number of different systems around the country where this kind of thing is done. Some examples would be, for example, LAPD famously has a civilian board that is responsible for ultimately hire and fire the chief, even though it's really the mayor kind of making most of that decision, approving the budget, having a significant role in the review and editing of various policies. So as far as the appointment and election of the members of this commission in this proposal, it would have the mayor nominating who to serve on it. The board would take a vote and approve the members. For the first 3 years, just as a transitional element, it would, or rather, sorry, so that's one option. The second option is that for the first 3 years, it's done that way where mayor approves the village board votes, and then after that, it's done as an election where people run for and are elected to that position. So two different ways of doing it, two different proposals that can be discussed. But as far as eligibility for it, so for starters, it's a 3-year term. Whoever, whether it's a position that's run for or through just strictly nomination, that person would not need to be an American citizen. They couldn't be an immediate family member of police department employees. Although if it was an election, there may be some issues with that legally, although that would have to be clarified. Maximum of 3 consecutive terms, and then so maximum of 9 years total among those 3 terms. People would not be able to serve on both the CB or CCRB and the commission at the same time. So this would require changing some elements of the village code where currently it refers to village board who sits as commissioner. So that would be changed to the new police commissioner board. So upon this creation, another potential would be to have it be at least a few of those members be comprised of people from this working committee, so that there's kind of that transfer of institutional knowledge. So this is a pretty big fundamental change that would certainly add a different method of governance. From a day-to-day affairs perspective, this isn't changing the chief's role. It's not changing the chief's role at all. What it's simply doing is, instead of the village board functioning as police commissioners, it would be a separate board that would still have 2 board members on it, but it would also have 5 community members serving on that board as well.
So you can put that in if you'd like, just to be legally clear. You'd have to change the village charter, and you'd have to petition Westchester County to change the Westchester Police Act, which
definitely
legislation that touches every village in Westchester County. So that's
among all of the suggested recommendations here, potential changes, this is the most involved in terms of the hurdles that would need to be established. Certainly not in terms of fiscally, because it wouldn't be that significant of a fiscal change, other than the fact that, as you're saying, the village charter would need to be changed. Westchester County would be in a position to allow this to happen, but one that also has kind of significant long-term ramifications in terms of how the police department is governed.
I'm sorry, I have to go.
Okay, sorry, Gabby.
Yeah, but thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, you too. So lastly, transparency was something that we looked at as a subcommittee. So looking at how the police department reports things, how it is transparent about things like policies. So firstly, repeating one from the Policies and Procedures Subcommittee, that the policy manual, the general orders of the police department, is something that is publicly available on the village website. And additionally, if someone doesn't have access to the internet computer, they could go to a village property, get a hard copy for free that would have the same content. So additionally, moving forward, following the plan on the implementation phase of it, the police department would be required to give a report on what changes have been implemented, what's in progress, what is yet to be implemented or isn't intended to be implemented at village board meetings once every month. So if the governance suggested recommendations are enacted and there's a new police commissioner board, that board would then also have ability to provide input and review new policies and have a role in reviewing use of force policies every 5 years on a regular basis. Secondly, from a transparency perspective, this is something that's really common throughout the country, ranging from small departments all the way to some of the biggest departments in the country, are having names and contact info for police personnel, specifically anyone who's command staff, anyone ranked lieutenant and above. So it's not their personal cell phones, but it's a way to directly get in contact with those people. Secondly, reporting on the demographics of the police department on the website, but also making regular reports in several areas, including how job opportunities or recruitment are conducted, as far as what methods are being used, where they're being advertised, et cetera. Having a process of regular reporting to the board or the created police commission on arrest and stop statistics by demographic, but also positive demographics. So whatever metrics are decided upon, that's another topic, but some way to kind of have that other element into it so that people know, everything that the police department is involved with. Additionally, specifically looking at the unmarked marked cars used for predominantly traffic enforcement, to kind of do a deeper dive on traffic enforcement activities, other proactive policing efforts in Ossining. I believe that is all we had. So any questions, discussion, feedback on that? Rich, I think you have one more subcommittee.
I think the recruitment, hiring, and training subcommittee can go relatively quickly. So first of all, on hiring, a general goal, and then really a program or practice in support of that. On hiring, the general statement being that the department should reflect the community in its hiring and promotions as a way to increase diversity, more consistent with the makeup of the community. And one way of doing that would be to start recruiting as early as possible in the Ossining High School. And that has a lot of positive consequences in terms of the relationship between students and the police officers, but also future recruitments. There's lots of sub ideas here, use of police explorers, cadet programs, things like that, to be able to try to increase the long-term makeup of the community to be more diverse and local as well, recognizing a lot of the police officers in the department now are local as well. On training, a number of recommendations, mostly pretty high priority, some medium, but mostly high priority, to add training topics to the training plan for the department in a 3 to 5 year way, prioritized way, dealing with anti-racism, implicit bias, crisis intervention training, which goes to the department's capability, what we talked about earlier about their ability to better respond to, for example, incidents where some mental health skills are involved, de-escalation training, procedural justice, cultural competency, and Spanish immersions, how to handle protests. So we've got a plan there. And I think the important part of that is that you can't give all this training to everybody in the department in year one, to develop a multi-year plan to do that, but stage it in a way so that you're not training everybody in implicit bias in year one, but you train, let's say 20% of the department in that each year for 5 years. And so you've got the ability to bring these perspectives and additional competencies to the department, but doing it over a period of time, but not saying that de-escalation training or changes to it than what you've got right now is scheduled for year 3 for everybody. So that's what cohort training is. And so we're recommending, or the committee's recommending, an approach to doing that over 4 to 5 years. Any comments there?
Yeah, that's way too spread out. So just so everybody's clear, we would never conduct training over the course of 5 years, or since you've got 4 topics, I think that would be 4 years. Yale Law School is doing the study right now, and their thesis is that implicit bias loses effect after 24 months. So training somebody and coming back to it 5 years later would be a waste of some significant funds, because training the department with a top shelf trainer just for that topic alone is, I think our bill was somewhere around $20,000 or $25,000. So To be clear on everybody, when we implement all these, first of all, implicit bias has already been around for a couple of years. We've been doing that. De-escalation as an individual topic isn't done, but it's implemented throughout all the rest of our training. So if we were going to implement all these different types of trainings, they'd have to be done annually. Spanish immersion, I have no idea how that be accomplished, because I don't know that you can mandate somebody to speak another language. I don't know how we would even accomplish that, but all the other topics there, and you can't do that once. Certainly you study Spanish once every 5 years. You'll be worse than my wife, trying to help her kids with dual language homework. So if we do all these things, they'll be done essentially every year, every other year. There's no way we could spread them out that far, so they'd be accomplished much faster than that. But most of
that's a really good point, Chief.
Yeah. I really wouldn't want to train a cop in de-escalation and then come back to it 5 years later and then stand by that. So procedural justice, same way. These are things that have to be done on a regular and ongoing basis. So we'd accomplish that much quicker than 5 years. You can write that into the plan, though.
Yeah.
My question then is how many, because I know there is a limit on hours in terms of how much, we can give training, right? So is it possible to have anti-racism, CIT, implicit bias, de-escalation, procedural justice all done in 1 year?
I don't know, because I don't know what those training evolutions look like. I don't know how many hours they are. I don't know if I can package them together as a single day to accomplish 2 or 3 different topics at the same time. I don't know if they're multiple days. I couldn't tell you.
CIT is 40 hours, just as an example.
Right, and that would be over, from what we were analyzing, that would be over the hours technically that you have left for training for your officers.
Right. Well, I think
I'm not really sure where you got that from, because we don't have a set numbers that we don't max out training. We've never said, here's the maximum amount you can have. We have a number that's required under New York State, but those topics are specific mandated topics. So we factor in as much training as we can for as many people as we can. And if we have a topic that has to be done, it has to be done. An entire department for a 40-hour evolution, that's a heavy lift.
Right.
In terms of the other topics there, implicit bias was a 1-day training. Procedural justice is a 1-day training. De-escalation is probably packaged together with use of force. Yeah. So, some of these things are accomplished together with other things, right. But cultural competency is probably a half day that you'd package together with something else.
Well, I think with what you're saying, that the more appropriate way to deal with this additional training is to deal with each of these differently. Some of them are important enough, like anti-racism, implicit bias, procedural justice, where every year or two, this has to be part of the training curriculum for everybody. Something like CIT might be something that you do 20% of the department per year. Something like de-escalation may be less frequent than
I think if this report were being really serious about how this gets accomplished, it would put things in, put priorities, and I don't think you can put deadlines in them without knowing what you're actually talking about. So there's already a requirement that everybody wants feedback on how it gets done. So it's not to the level that people wouldn't know. Right. But I don't think you can put a deadline in things that you don't know what it is.
So it seems that the deadline would be 1 to 2 years so that it's effective, right? From your recommendation.
Implicit bias specifically, that's the study being done.
Right.
And we did that 2 years ago, and we're scheduled to do it again now.
Right. So instead of putting 4 to 5 years, what we could do, so I was the one who suggested the cohorts. And so what I was saying by cohorts, I mean, it doesn't have to be 4 to 5 years. If your suggestion is that that's that's too far of a span, then I understand that. If we can cut it to 1 or every other year, right? So half or 20, 40% of the officers are trained 1 year on implicit bias. The next year they wouldn't have it, right? But the other cohort would, and that way they could have anti-racism. And every other year they would flip on what they are trained on. And officers are hopefully, right, learning from each other. If one officer sees what they just learned from implicit bias, right, then they can learn from the other in terms of what they learned from anti-racism. The other thing is that we can ensure, or not ensure, but the probability of an officer who comes to a call that is now, there's one with an anti-racism and one with a crisis intervention training at the same call is higher than if we wait, right, like 2 years or, you know, if we can't get all of this done, because I am aware that this is not, it doesn't seem feasible, right? To give officers 80 hours because all of this is important this year or next year, because of the budget and because of the time. So that was the recommendation, that because it is important, we want to make sure that officers do have these trainings. We split them up by cohorts so that we do have officers that have all of this training that is up to date every year.
Right. My point is that we don't even know what these trainings are. So I'm not sure that anybody's found an anti-racist training yet and how many hours that is for police departments. I don't know anybody else that's doing it. So we have to go find it and get a curriculum for it.
We have looked them up. That's what we did in our subcommittee training.
And how many hours is that training?
So the anti-racism is typically 40 hours. These are long trainings. They're not short trainings.
Then I'll tell you that doing all of these, even within 2 or 3 years, is just a highly unlikelihood. To take 60 police officers. No, and I'm being realistic about how you're going to accomplish all this at all.
And that's why we made the number 3 to 5, because we were trying to be realistic on how we can actually get this to move forward, right? So
you're talking about
unrealistic.
Over the course of 5 years, you're talking millions of dollars in terms of overtime to take the entire department out for a week apiece for 7 different times. If you say that each of these is, that more than one of these is a 40-hour course, and I have to take every single employee out of the roll call, I can't put a time frame on that because we're going to have to find a new way of scheduling our department in order to accomplish that, and that's fine. But I'm telling you that what you've described is really an oversimplification of what's going to happen. It's going to have to be a whole new way of looking at scheduling in order to do that amount of training. I love it. I think training's great. Every cop says, I want more training. We want more training. That's the cry from people. That's sort of the knee-jerk reaction is train people. But this is, you're talking about the average cop getting 24 hours of training in New York State and in-service training. We do anywhere between 40 and 80 a year. You're talking about 200 hours of training a year for a cop here. So we're gonna have to review schedules and how these things get done.
That's why I said in the beginning, right, that there might be a cap on how much you can put on an officer, and you said there really isn't.
Well,
but,
there's not a numerical cap. There's not a numerical cap on how much training we're willing to give somebody. When you say that you have, so in other words, if I want to send a cop to 7 different trainings and they're all one day, I'll find days that I can send people to those trainings and do those things. Once you start requiring them as large block training in entire departments at the same time. In other words, if you say, hey, we want 2 crisis negotiators and we want 5 people to go to bike school and we want 3 people to go to that, those are easy because they're spread out throughout the year. Entire squads leaving for the whole day leaves nobody policing the village. The complication with this is that we cannot close for the day. So where your business may close their doors and say, well, we're training today, or for this week we do no business, or we're operating remotely, we can't operate remotely, we can't shut down. So either we can't train somebody or we pay overtime. And when you start paying full squads 24 hours a day of overtime, you're going to talk millions of dollars in doing that. So this will require a rethinking of our schedule on some level in order to make that happen. There is no cap on the number of hours of training we can give somebody, but there's context in terms of the schedule. So
the schedule suggestion is in cohort, but also, right, like this is the reform and reinvention model, right? So when we're talking about reinvention, there you go, right? Let's reinvent scheduling as part of this reform then.
Again, that's going to go back to collective bargaining agreements. And when you change people's schedules, some of that is going to be negotiable. So I can't guarantee that all of that's going to be able to be done right away, but it's things that we're going to have to look at and see how much some of this we can do right away.
Yeah.
But it's going to have to be.
We have some of the detail that you're talking about, and we can provide that in the plan in terms of how this could actually work. All of these aren't high priority. Some of them are. And we also have all the training records and know what you're training on now. Some of that might be trade out for what you're training on now. So I'd say wait for a little bit more detail on this, because I think as Maita says, this is part of police reform, and we want to try to make as much of this work as possible. And
I do want to suggest or add that I see that it's medium priority for the how to handle protests due to the political climate. I think that should be a high priority. I don't know how long those trainings are, but if that's something that I will look into in terms of how to handle protests, how to keep our officers safe, but also how to keep our community safe when it comes to protests.
Mhm. Just lost a medium priority. There we go. So let's work this through and see the extent to which it's can develop a practical plan for these high priority training. I don't think anybody's disagreeing that these are important aspects of training today. So that's what we'll do. Any other comments? Okay, so where do we go from here? We need in the next week to develop a draft plan to take to the village board that is importantly an expansion of these things here in terms of exploring with a little bit more detail how they would be implemented, the degree of difficulty in implementing them, some of the other important issues associated with collective bargaining needs and things like that. Also, this plan has to have some important elements about the process that has been employed, summaries of the community input that we received in the community meetings, as well as in the community survey that has been out there, and how this all fits into a context of executive order, or the executive order from the state. So we've got a lot of work to do over the next week. So the plan is for the village to take the plan to the board at a work session on the last Wednesday of the month, the 27th. So that's a work session again, not a public meeting per se. So that would be followed up by public meeting or public meetings in February or possibly early March, where community input is received. So the board needs to get whatever they're going to have at a meeting as much as a week before the meeting. So that puts pressure on us to turn something around that we can discuss with them at a meeting on the 27th. And that means that we've got to turn something around by next Wednesday or Thursday. So I'm opening it up to the board, to the working committee here, about how you are involved in a review prior to the village board meeting. Because I don't think we've got the time frame available to say we develop a plan, we submit it to you, you've got a couple of days to look at it, we make revisions as necessary, and then get it to the village board. So there would be some concurrency here. And remember, this is not going to be, while there will be a report that'll be public at that point, it will be draft. This is going to be draft until the middle of March. Remember that the village is submitting whatever final product comes out of this by April the 1st to meet the terms of the executive order. So that means they need to have some final report by, let's say, the middle of March. So we've got some time to work on this, but we're a little constrained in the next week or two.
So do you want to just send us pieces as you finish them? Would that make sense? So as one section is finished, send that to us for our review while you're working on the next sections.
We could try to do it. So there's a lot that's going to happen. So the community meetings, for example, we have notes from them. We have the recordings. We can make those, and you've seen some of those for those of you who were at the meeting. So those aren't too difficult. The community survey is going to take some time to summarize. We had, Ian, you can talk a little bit more about this. We had a lot of responses, like close to 1,000. And so it's going to be important to do a thorough analysis of that. And it only just closed yesterday.
Last time, yeah.
Yeah. So,
Richard, were there notes taken at the African American meeting?
yeah, yes.
Okay, all right.
So on the survey, I mean, we need to provide you more than just a high level summary of 60% of the community said this and 40% said that. I think, especially given the importance of the topic and the difference in perceptions across the community, to do an analysis that shows different perceptions toward the police based on race or ethnicity, things like that are going to be really important. So I'm saying that since it just closed, we haven't started analyzing it. That's not going to happen tomorrow, but it would be more like next week sometime. So it's still going to be a compressed time frame in terms of taking these 4 subject areas. That's still next week, and it still would be just a couple of days. But doing it incrementally is possibly the only way to get some of it, the review, accelerated at all. Well, I guess all I can say is we'll do the best we can.
I have a question. I'm not sure if this is something that you can answer or maybe I have to follow up with the village, but in terms of transparency, we are recording this session because we want to make sure that community members have the opportunity to see what we are discussing. But I would like to know how soon that can be posted on the village website or wherever they plan on posting it, so that the community can give us the input that we might need before finalizing if they feel like there's something that we are missing, as well as adding these notes that you have here, so that they can review. So I guess my question is, how fast can this recording and these notes be shared with the community?
So Ian's been recording it. We can turn that around by tomorrow morning. I will get an email out to Jamie, the person who manages these things for the website with the village, and we'll make some edits to these notes here, and we'll get her the recording and these notes to post online tomorrow. So in terms of feedback on what we're coming up with and the way we've described, I think it's probably the only realistic way of doing it is to provide one-on-one comments to us, because our hands are pretty tied in terms of getting the first draft of this to the board. They asked for Wednesday, but I think more realistic, it's going to be next Thursday.
Richard, I have a question about the public meetings. How will that be approached, like we did before with the breakdown of different segments? How are we going to approach that?
Yeah, to be determined. I would imagine that since the whole report will be out there, you're right, there's 1 of 2 ways. You have a general input on the report or you break it up. I haven't discussed that with the village at all.
Okay. I have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, we'll keep those thoughts and let's talk to the village about that. Because I think if you're suggesting that breaking it down is an appropriate way of doing it, it provides more focus to the areas of the discussion than if it's just an open vote.
Yeah.
But I think that having this, available would be able to get very specific information on where people want to make input or add their suggestions.
Yeah, so I agree. So we will share things via the Google Docs as we've been doing up to this point, and we'll be at work here over the next week. Any other comments? Hey, I really think this is a great meeting. There were some difficult times, but you can't get through topics like this without some difficult conversations. So, and there'll be more. But, there were also a lot of points of consensus too. There were some points that I thought were going to be controversial that, at least at this point, weren't all that controversial. So I think we all are on this committee because we want the right form of policing in the community. And this is a great process for getting there. So let's go to the next step.
Agreed.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening. Thanks for your time this evening. Go have dinner.
All right. Take
Thank
care.
you, everybody.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.